The message was short, just a few lines of Japanese text, intercepted by chance at a small code-breaking station in the middle of the Pacific. It read, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto will depart Rabaul at 0600. Arrive Bougainville, 0945. Inside a dimly lit hut at Station Hypo, a group of young codebreakers froze. They stared at the decrypted message in disbelief. They had just discovered the personal travel schedule of the man who planned Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto, Japan's most brilliant admiral, the architect of the surprise attack that had plunged America into war, was about to fly into range of U.S. fighters. It was the kind of intelligence that came once in a lifetime, but it also came with a question that no one in that room could answer. What do you do when you can see your enemy's heartbeat? If they acted on this, Japan would know their codes were broken. The entire ultra-intelligence network could collapse. Thousands of lives might be lost. If they didn't act, Yamamoto, the mind that had humiliated the U.S. Navy, would live to strike again. Across the Pacific, in a small tent on Guadalcanal, a group of American pilots would soon be given an order that didn't make sense. No one told them how their target was found. No one told them why the mission had to be exact to the minute. Their orders were simple. Find him, kill him, and don't come back if you fail. What followed would become one of the most precise aerial ambushes in history, a mission calculated not by luck or radar, but by mathematics. A math trap that turned the tides of the Pacific and ended the life of Japan's most powerful admiral, down to the very minute he said he would arrive. Before there was a target in the sky, there was a wound that refused to close. 2 years earlier, on a calm Sunday morning in December 1941, America woke to fire and ruin. The man behind it all was a quiet, brilliant strategist, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He had studied at Harvard, toured American shipyards, and once warned his own government. If war comes with the United States, I will run wild for 6 months. After that, I can promise nothing. And he was right. For 6 months, Japan ruled the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, victory after victory. Yet Yamamoto had never wanted that war. He knew Japan could not win a long fight against an industrial giant. But once the attack succeeded, he became the symbol of it, the face of the empire's pride. By 1943, his name carried mythical weight. To the Japanese people, he was invincible. To the Americans, he was the ghost that haunted every letter from a grieving mother. Across the Pacific, that hatred hardened into obsession. In the offices of naval intelligence, his face hung on briefing walls like a wanted poster. When codebreakers finally decrypted his travel plans, the message spread through every command tent like lightning. Yamamoto, the mind that had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, was going to be in the air. For the pilots on Guadalcanal, this wasn't strategy anymore. It was justice. But there was one problem. Bougainville was 400 miles away, beyond the range of every fighter they had. Except one, the P-38 Lightning. Twin engines, long range, fast enough to strike and vanish. If they could calculate the exact time and place, they could catch the Admiral's bomber before it ever reached the ground. That meant no radar, no landmarks, no second chances, only math. And so, while politicians toasted the idea of revenge, one young navigator quietly began drawing lines on a map, setting a trap in the sky so perfect that even Yamamoto's precision would lead him straight into it. He didn't know it yet, but his numbers would decide the fate of Japan's most famous admiral. Down to the very minute, in a small, sweltering building on Hawaii's Pearl Harbor base, the irony not lost on anyone. A group of cryptanalysts worked through the night. The smell of ink and sweat mixed with the constant hum of decoding machines. They were the unsung soldiers of a different war. A war fought with pencils, logic, and silence. Their leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was as eccentric as he was brilliant. He worked barefoot, wore a red smoking jacket, and slept beside the machines. His team at Station Hypo had been breaking Japanese naval ciphers since before Pearl Harbor, and now, for the first time, they had something extraordinary. An enemy's plan down to the minute. The message itself was routine. Inspection flights, times, coordinates, escort details. But when Rochefort read the name Yamamoto, his hand stopped. He read it again, slower. There was no mistake. The architect of Pearl Harbor was announcing his itinerary like a train schedule, and he'd be flying over Allied-controlled waters. For a moment, no one spoke. The gravity of it pressed on the room like heat. If this information leaked, Japan would instantly change their ciphers. The Allies would lose the greatest advantage of the Pacific War. Ultra. Rochefort called Admiral Chester Nimitz at once. The line was brief. "Admiral, we have Yamamoto's flight plan." A pause. Then Nimitz's calm reply. "Can you confirm?" Rochefort nodded, though the Admiral couldn't see it. "It's genuine, and it's insane." Nimitz knew what that meant. Acting on this intelligence was like showing your hand in the middle of a poker game. It could win you the round, or cost you the war. But Yamamoto wasn't just another target. He was Japan's brain, the man who'd humiliated the United States, who'd turned Pearl Harbor into a graveyard of steel. Killing him wouldn't just strike at Japan's heart. It would echo across every ship, every island, every campfire in the Pacific. So Nimitz made the call. "We'll take the risk." From that moment, secrecy wrapped the mission tighter than armor. Only a handful of officers would ever know the truth. Orders were written by hand, burned after reading. No one outside the intelligence chain was to know why or how the mission existed. The operation was given a name: Vengeance. And somewhere in a tent on Guadalcanal, a quiet navigator was handed a chart, a compass, and a single, terrifying line. "Find Yamamoto. You have 10 minutes to be perfect." Before dawn on April 18, 1943, a circle of tired men bent over a map inside a tent on Guadalcanal. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the metallic scent of sweat. At the center sat a young lieutenant named Doug Canning, a quiet navigator with a pencil behind his ear and the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The problem was impossible. The Japanese admiral's bomber would be in the air for less than 2 hours, crossing a vast stretch of ocean invisible to the naked eye. The Americans had no radar guidance, no beacons, no mid-air refueling. To reach him, they'd have to fly 400 miles out, through enemy territory, at wave-top height to avoid detection, then arrive at a single point in the sky within 1 minute of the enemy's arrival. One mistake in math, and they'd find nothing but empty sky, and run out of fuel before making it home. Canning leaned closer to the map, sweat running down his temples. Using a slide rule, a compass, and raw trigonometry, he began constructing what pilots would later call the math trap. He accounted for wind drift, curvature, and the pull of the Earth's rotation. He scribbled numbers across the map like an artist sketching a portrait. Yamamoto departs Rabaul at 0600. Estimated speed 180 knots. Flight duration 1 hour 45. He drew intersecting lines, one from Rabaul, one from Guadalcanal. At their crossing point, he circled a single spot over Bougainville's dense jungle. Then he calculated the heading, fuel burn, and time of arrival for every P-38 Lightning. The math said the interception would occur 0934. Yamamoto's plane was scheduled to arrive 0945. 11 minutes difference. Just enough to climb above the horizon unseen, dive, and strike. Major John Mitchell, the squadron commander, stared at the coordinates and nodded. "You sure about this, Lieutenant?" Canning didn't look up. "If they're on time, we'll meet them head on." "And if they're early?" Mitchell asked. Canning finally raised his eyes, calm, certain. "Then we're already dead." Outside, the crews began arming the P-38s with long-range tanks. They carried no bombs, no armor, only fuel, guns, and silence. Each pilot understood that no rescue was possible. The ocean below would be their grave if the math was wrong. When the briefing ended, the men stepped into the light. The engines of 16 Lightnings began to rumble, a metallic chorus that rolled across the jungle like thunder. At 0725, they lifted off one by one, climbing east into the dawn. Ahead lay nothing but water, wind, and the trust in a few inches of pencil line drawn by a man with a slide rule. The trap was set. Dawn broke over Guadalcanal in a slow, orange haze. The air was heavy with humidity and the smell of fuel. 16 P-38 Lightnings stood lined up on the coral strip, their long twin engines glinting in the half-light. Ground crews moved like ghosts, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, wiping oil from nacelles. Every man knew this mission wasn't routine. There would be no radio chatter, no second chances. The flight path stretched more than 400 miles over open water. Too far for rescue, too far for error. If anyone went down, they vanished. Major John Mitchell walked down the row of aircraft, helmet tucked under his arm. He didn't give speeches. He just nodded at each man, tapping the aluminum skin of every plane he passed. The engines were already rumbling, a low growl that vibrated through the ground. At 0725, one after another, the Lightnings leapt from the runway. Their long shadows swept over the jungle as they climbed, then leveled off, heading north, skimming the ocean at 50 feet to stay below Japanese radar. The Pacific stretched out endless and empty. No land, no ships, no markers. Only the compass and the math in Doug Canning's head. He checked his watch. The intercept point was still 2 hours away. Every minute meant another fraction of a degree correction. Tiny adjustments between life and oblivion. The flight was a study in silence. No one spoke. The engines roared at perfect sync, and the sea beneath them blurred into silver streaks. At this height, a single bird strike could tear a wing apart. One of the pilots later said it felt like flying inside a heartbeat. They reached the halfway mark, and fuel gauges already dipped below safe levels. Sweat pooled inside flight suits. The air smelled of metal and adrenaline. Then, far ahead on the horizon, a faint outline of Bougainville Island began to rise from the mist. Dense jungle, smoke plumes, and somewhere beyond it, a small strip of airfield where Japan's most famous admiral would soon be landing. Mitchell glanced at his watch. 0933. He keyed his mic, his voice calm but tight. All flights, hold altitude. Stand by to climb. They're coming. The trap was about to spring. At 0934, right on the second Lieutenant Doug Canning's pencil had predicted, the Japanese formation appeared. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers gliding in perfect symmetry, their aluminum bodies flashing in the sunlight, escorted by 6 Zero fighters dancing around them like silver daggers. Mitchell spotted them first. Target in sight, he murmured over the radio, voice steady but electric. 16 P-38 split formation. Half the squadron climbed high, the others stayed low, hugging the sea for the ambush. Canning's math had been perfect. The Americans were in position, behind and below, invisible until it was too late. Major Mitchell's calm voice came through the headset again. Okay, boys, let's go kill Yamamoto. The Lightnings began their climb. Airspeed increased. The cockpits shook with vibration as engines strained. The pilots could now see the Japanese bombers clearly, sleek, vulnerable, unaware. In the lead Betty, Admiral Yamamoto sat upright in his uniform, white gloves on, reviewing documents. He was punctual as ever. His co-pilot looked up through the canopy and froze. Out of the sun, like steel hawks, came the Americans. 2 P-38s, flown by Lieutenant Rex Barber and Lieutenant Thomas Lanfear, peeled away and dove straight toward the bombers. The rest broke left to hold off the escorting Zeros. Barber locked onto the lead bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto. His guns chattered, 4 streams of .50 caliber bullets lacing across the sky. The Betty's left engine exploded into flame. Smoke billowed. Inside, chaos, shrapnel, screams, fire. The plane rolled onto its side, losing altitude fast. Lanfear caught sight of the second bomber and raked it from nose to tail. It burst apart mid-air, fragments spiraling into the jungle below. The Zeros finally reacted, diving in, guns blazing, tracers ripping through the humid air. A twisting, spinning dance of death filled the sky. One American plane was hit, another grazed, but the formation held. The dogfight lasted barely a minute, yet it felt eternal. Then Barber looked down. One of the bombers was gone, swallowed by the trees. The other burned on a distant hillside. Silence fell over the comms. They'd done it. 9 minutes ahead of schedule. Exactly as predicted. Barber's breathing came hard through the radio. Mitchell, target destroyed. There was no cheering, no celebration, just static, then Mitchell's quiet reply. Let's go home, boys. We're out of fuel. The lightnings banked south, their long shadows stretching over the green canopy below. Behind them, a column of black smoke rose slowly from the jungle. The end of Admiral Yamamoto. Hours later, deep in the Bougainville jungle, a group of Japanese soldiers hacked their way toward a column of rising smoke. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and wet earth. They followed the trail of twisted branches until they reached the wreckage. The shattered skeleton of a bomber. Its tail snapped, its wings torn by impact. The cockpit was crushed, but still recognizable. Amid the wreck, surrounded by charred metal and splintered bamboo, sat a man in full uniform, slumped but untouched by the fire. His gloved hands still rested gently on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. His cap lay perfectly in his lap. It was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The soldiers stood in silence. No one spoke. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Their commander, trembling, removed his helmet and bowed. Others followed, wordlessly, one after another. A quiet procession in the shadow of a man who had built an empire of war. They wrapped his body carefully, lifting it from the wreckage like a relic. A young private whispered, "He died standing, still at his post." Back at Rabaul, when word of the loss reached headquarters, disbelief turned to grief. Japan's newspapers would call it fate. The admiral who met death on time. But among the officers, there was a darker realization. If Yamamoto's plane had been intercepted, someone had known his schedule. Paranoia began to spread. How could the Americans have known? Had their codes been broken? No one dared say it aloud, but every commander suspected the truth. Yet, in the chaos of mourning, one detail went unnoticed. How precisely the ambush had been timed. The Americans hadn't stumbled upon Yamamoto by chance. They had been waiting, down to the very minute he said he would arrive. Back on Guadalcanal, the pilots returned to base running on fumes. The landing gear of several planes locked up mid-approach, forcing them to crash land on the coral strip. When the engines finally stopped, there was no applause, no briefing. Just men climbing down from their cockpits, eyes hollow from exhaustion and disbelief. They had done the impossible, but they didn't yet know the cost. The mission that avenged Pearl Harbor would soon become one of the most tightly held secrets of the entire war. When the lightnings rolled to a stop on Guadalcanal, there was no band waiting, no medals, no fanfare. Mechanics rushed forward with fuel cans and stretchers, but the airfield stayed eerily quiet. Every man knew they had just done something extraordinary, something the world might never hear about. Major Mitchell climbed from his cockpit, stiff and pale, fuel almost gone. He looked at the line of exhausted pilots and said the only words that mattered. "You're alive. That's enough." But within hours, the silence began. Orders came down from command. No mention of Yamamoto. No mention of how you found him. This mission never happened. It was for security, they said. The Japanese could never suspect that their codes were broken. If they changed them now, the Allies would lose months, maybe years of intelligence advantage. So the victory that should have shaken the world was buried in classified files, stamped top secret and locked away. The codebreakers at Station Hypo went back to work, their triumph unspoken. The pilots were told to describe the mission as a routine patrol. Newspapers back home reported vague headlines about enemy aircraft shot down. No names, no details. For the men who had flown through hell on pencil-thin margins, it was a strange emptiness. They had avenged Pearl Harbor. They had killed the mind behind the Pacific War, and yet they couldn't even tell their families why they'd gone. Over the years, as the story leaked in fragments, controversy began to swirl. Who fired the fatal burst? Rex Barber or Tom Lanphier? Whose bullets hit Yamamoto's bomber first? The official record was murky, the reports contradictory. The real genius behind the mission, Doug Canning, the navigator who'd drawn the math trap, was barely mentioned at all. He was transferred quietly to another unit, his name lost in paperwork. But every man who'd flown that day remembered the moment his pencil drew that perfect circle on the map. They knew the mission had never been about credit. It had been about precision, courage, and revenge held in check by discipline. And so, they kept the secret. For years, the public never knew that the death of Japan's greatest admiral had been predicted, not by luck, but by geometry. Decades passed before the full story emerged. When the war ended and the classified files were finally opened, historians began piecing together what really happened that morning over Bougainville. The calculations were checked, the timings verified, and what they found was staggering. Lieutenant Doug Canning's intercept math had been accurate within 1 minute. No radar, no GPS, no computers. Just a man with a slide rule, a compass, and an understanding of how the Earth moved beneath an airplane's wings. It wasn't chance that killed Admiral Yamamoto. It was geometry, executed by pilots who trusted one man's pencil more than luck. For Japan, Yamamoto's death was more than the loss of a commander. It was the loss of balance. He had been the realist, the one leader who understood that Japan's empire was built on borrowed time. After his fall, the war became desperate, reckless. His ashes were returned to Tokyo in silence. Thousands lined the streets as his urn passed, a reminder that even the strongest vision could be undone by a single coordinate. For the Americans, the mission became a study in moral precision. They had hunted a man, not an army. They had avenged Pearl Harbor, but they had also crossed a line between strategy and assassination. A gray area that future wars would walk again and again. Years later, when journalists interviewed the surviving pilots, none spoke of vengeance. They spoke of tension, exhaustion, and awe. That their math had worked. That somehow, over a featureless ocean, they'd met their target exactly where he said he'd be. One of them said quietly, "When we found him, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like inevitability." Today, aviation cadets still study that intercept. It's taught not as an act of war, but as an act of perfection. The moment when human skill met machine precision and changed the course of the Pacific. And somewhere in the archives of military history, amid the ink and dust of old mission logs, one name finally reappeared. Lieutenant Doug Canning, the man who drew the line that trapped an empire. Because in the end, it wasn't bullets that killed Yamamoto. It was the quiet certainty of mathematics, and the men who believed in it.